All I noticed was a sudden blackout after my dad slapped me at my sister's wedding. The sting burned across my cheek like fire, but the silence that followed cut deeper than any physical pain ever could. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto me in that moment, frozen in disbelief. The music stopped mid-note, glasses clinked to a halt, and even the photographer's camera seemed to pause in shock. There I stood, center stage at what was supposed to be my sister's perfect day, with my father's handprint blazing red across my face and my dignity scattered like confetti on the marble floor. Like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, because what happened next, nobody could have imagined. You want to know how I got here? How a daughter ends up getting slapped by her own father in front of 200 wedding guests. Let me take you back to where this story really begins, back to a childhood where I learned that being invisible was sometimes the safest place to be. I was always the shadow in our family, the afterthought, the one who got introduced with a casual, "Oh, and this is our other daughter." While my sister Emma was the golden child who could do no wrong, I was the mistake that kept on disappointing. Every report card, every achievement, every small victory I managed to scrape together was met with the same lukewarm response. "That's nice, dear." Meanwhile, Emma would bring home a B- and get a celebration dinner. The favoritism wasn't subtle. It was glaring, obvious, and painful in ways that leave scars you can't see but feel every single day. When Emma got her first car at 16, I got a lecture about responsibility and earning my keep. When she went to college, our parents threw a going-away party. When I graduated valedictorian from high school, Dad was too busy at work to show up to the ceremony. Mom made excuses, as always. "You know how your father is with his work. He's very proud of you, sweetheart." But I knew better. I had learned to read the language of indifference, and my father spoke it fluently when it came to me. The worst part wasn't the neglect itself, it was watching everyone else pretend it wasn't happening. Family dinners where Emma's latest boyfriend was welcomed like royalty while my achievements went unmentioned. Holiday gatherings where relatives would gush over Emma's beauty, her charm, her bright future, while I sat there like a piece of furniture that happened to share their DNA. I used to think it was something I did wrong, some fundamental flaw in my character that made me unlovable to the man who was supposed to love me unconditionally. I spent years trying to fix myself, to become someone worthy of his attention and affection. I excelled in school, thinking maybe academic success would finally make him proud. I volunteered at charities, hoping kindness would earn his respect. I even tried changing my appearance, my personality, my interests. Anything to become the daughter he might actually want to claim as his own. Nothing worked. The harder I tried, the more invisible I became, until I realized that my father hadn't just failed to see me, he had actively chosen not to. I was an inconvenience to him, a reminder of something he'd rather forget, though I never understood what that something was. By the time Emma announced her engagement to Richard, I had already built walls around my heart thick enough to withstand most of the casual cruelty that had become my family's specialty. I had learned to smile and nod and play the role of the supportive sister, even as every fiber of my being screamed at the injustice of it all. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what was coming. The wedding planning was a masterclass in my family's dysfunction. Every decision revolved around Emma's vision, Emma's dreams, Emma's perfect day. The fact that it was also supposed to be a celebration of family unity was conveniently forgotten whenever it came time to include me in anything meaningful. I wasn't asked to be maid of honor, that went to Emma's college roommate. I wasn't asked to give a speech, Dad had already reserved that honor for himself. I wasn't even consulted about the guest list, despite the fact that many of these people had known me my entire life. I was relegated to the role of just another guest, someone who happened to share a last name with the bride. The morning of the wedding arrived with all the chaos and excitement you'd expect. Emma was radiant in her dress, floating around the bridal suite like something out of a fairy tale. Mom was crying happy tears and fussing over every detail. Dad was in his element, playing the proud father role to perfection, greeting guests and accepting congratulations like he had personally orchestrated Emma's happiness. And me? I was getting ready in a corner of the bridal suite, trying to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible. My dress was beautiful. I had saved for months to buy something worthy of my sister's special day, but I felt like a fraud wearing it. No matter how much effort I put into my appearance, I knew I would always be the footnote in Emma's story. The ceremony itself was everything Emma had dreamed of. The venue was stunning, a historic mansion with soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that made everything sparkle like a dream. The flowers were perfect, the music was perfect, and Emma looked absolutely radiant as she walked down the aisle on Dad's arm. I watched from my assigned seat in the third row, not the front row with the immediate family, mind you, but the third row with the cousins and family friends, and I tried to feel happy for my sister. I really did. She deserved this day, this joy, this celebration of love. She had found someone who adored her, who saw her worth and wanted to spend his life proving it to her every single day. But watching Dad beam with pride as he walked her down the aisle, seeing the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, feeling the collective sigh of satisfaction from our relatives as they witnessed this perfect family moment. It was like swallowing glass. This was the father I had always wanted, the love I had always craved, and it was being lavished on someone who had never gone a day without it. The reception started beautifully. The cocktail hour was elegant, the dinner was exquisite, and the speeches were heartfelt and touching. Emma and Richard's first dance was like something out of a movie, and I found myself genuinely smiling for the first time all day as I watched them move together, lost in their own little world of happiness. But then came the family photos, and that's when the familiar sting of exclusion began to creep back in. The photographer gathered the immediate family for formal portraits, and I dutifully took my place at the edge of the group. Dad positioned himself front and center, his arm around Emma, his chest puffed out with paternal pride. Mom stood beside him, radiant and elegant. Richard stood on Emma's other side, looking handsome and confident. And me? I was positioned at the very edge of the frame, an afterthought, a space filler. When the photographer suggested we try a few different arrangements, I somehow kept ending up further and further from the center, until in some shots, I was barely visible at all. Perfect, Dad declared after one particularly elaborate arrangement where I was practically hidden behind a cousin. These will be beautiful for the album. The comments started during dinner. Little digs, subtle jabs disguised as conversation. Aunt Martha mentioned how proud Dad must be of Emma's success, her beautiful wedding, her wonderful husband. Uncle Joe raised a toast to Dad for raising such an accomplished daughter. Cousin Susan gushed about what a perfect family we were, how lucky Emma was to have such supportive parents. Each comment was like a small knife, carefully placed and twisted just enough to remind me of my place in this family hierarchy. I was the supporting cast in Emma's story, the extra who happened to be in the scene but wasn't important enough to have any lines. But it was Dad's speech that really set the stage for what was about to happen. He stood up at the head table, tapping his champagne glass with a fork, and the room fell silent. 200 guests turned their attention to him, ready to hear the father of the bride share his wisdom and love. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the elegant ballroom, "today is one of the proudest days of my life. When I look at my daughter Emma, I see everything I could have hoped for in a child. She's intelligent, beautiful, kind, and now she's found a man who recognizes all of those qualities and more." The crowd murmured appreciatively, and Emma glowed with happiness at the head table. "Emma has always been special," Dad continued, his voice thick with emotion. "From the moment she was born, I knew she was destined for greatness. She's exceeded every expectation, achieved every goal, and made her mother and me proud beyond words. Today, as I watch her begin this new chapter with Richard, I know that our legacy is in good hands. He raised his glass higher, and the room followed suit. To Emma and Richard, may your marriage be filled with the same joy and pride you've brought to our family. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Glasses clinked, people wiped away tears, and Emma beamed like the sun itself. It was a beautiful moment, a perfect father of the bride speech that would be remembered and cherished for years to come. There was just one problem. He had managed to give an entire speech about family and legacy without mentioning that he had another daughter sitting right there in the room. I felt the familiar burn of tears behind my eyes, but I forced them back. This was Emma's day. I would not ruin it with my own pain and disappointment. I would smile and clap and pretend that being erased from my own father's vision of our family was perfectly fine. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. As the evening progressed, the drinks flowed freely and inhibitions began to lower. Dad was holding court at a table full of his business associates, regaling them with stories of Emma's accomplishments and his pride in her success. I was making my way back from the restroom when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. "You're so lucky, Tom," one of his friends was saying. "Emma is just perfect. You must be thrilled to have such an accomplished daughter." "I am," Dad replied, his voice slightly slurred from the champagne. "She's everything a father could want. Smart, beautiful, successful, the complete package." "And what about your other daughter?" the friend asked, glancing in my direction. "She seems lovely too." Dad's expression shifted, his smile faltering for just a moment before he forced it back into place. "Oh, well, you know how it is. Some children just shine brighter than others. Emma's always been the star of our family." The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow. Not just the words themselves, but the ease with which he said them, the matter-of-fact way he relegated me to the shadows while celebrating my sister's light. I stood there in my beautiful dress, surrounded by 200 people who were celebrating love and family and joy, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was active, deliberate erasure. In my father's mind, I didn't just matter less than Emma. I barely existed at all. That's when something inside me snapped. The years of trying to earn his love, the decades of accepting scraps of affection while Emma feasted on unconditional adoration, the lifetime of making myself smaller and smaller to accommodate his indifference. It all came rushing to the surface in a wave of anger and pain that I could no longer contain. I walked over to his table, my heart pounding and my hands shaking with adrenaline. The conversation stopped as I approached, and Dad looked up at me with the same expression he might wear if a stranger had interrupted his dinner. "Dad," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest, "I need to talk to you." He frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Can't it wait? I'm in the middle of a conversation." "No," I said, louder this time. "It can't wait. I've been waiting my entire life for you to see me, to acknowledge me, to treat me like I matter even a little bit." "I'm done waiting." The table went quiet. His business associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly very interested in their champagne glasses. Dad's face began to redden, and I could see the anger building in his eyes. "This is neither the time nor the place for whatever this is," he said through gritted teeth, standing up from his chair. "You're making a scene at your sister's wedding." "I'm making a scene?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You just spent 20 minutes talking about your legacy and your family pride without mentioning that you have 2 daughters. You gave a speech about Emma being everything you could hope for in a child, as if I don't exist. And I'm the one making a scene." "Lower your voice," he hissed, glancing around at the other guests who were starting to notice our confrontation. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself?" The words came out louder than I intended, but I was past caring. "I've spent my entire life trying not to embarrass you, trying to be worthy of your love, trying to figure out what I did wrong to make my own father treat me like I'm nothing. And you want to talk about embarrassment? That's when he lost it. His face went from red to purple, his eyes blazed with rage, and for a moment I saw something in his expression that looked almost like hatred. He took a step closer to me, towering over me in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "You want to know what's embarrassing?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "Having a daughter who can't accept that some people are just meant for greatness, while others are meant to fade into the background. Emma has always been special, and you've always been ordinary. The sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be." The words hit me like a slap, but I stood my ground. "I may be ordinary, but I'm still your daughter. I'm still a human being who deserves basic respect and acknowledgement. I'm not asking you to love me the way you love Emma. I gave up on that dream years ago. I'm just asking you to treat me like I exist." "You want acknowledgement," he said, his voice rising now, drawing the attention of nearby tables. "Fine. Here's your acknowledgement. You are a disappointment. You always have been, and you always will be. You're standing here at your sister's wedding, making demands and causing drama because you can't stand that for once, the attention isn't on you. The attention has never been on me." I shot back, tears streaming down my face now. "Not once, not ever. I got perfect grades, you didn't notice. I graduated valedictorian, you didn't come. I started my own business, you never asked about it. I've spent 28 years of my life trying to earn 5 minutes of your genuine attention, and you act like I'm selfish for wanting my own father to care about me." The ballroom was getting quieter around us as more and more guests became aware of the scene unfolding. Emma was looking over from the head table, her face a mask of horror and embarrassment. Mom was frantically trying to signal for us to stop, but it was too late. The dam had burst, and 28 years of pain was flooding out. "You think you deserve attention?" Dad's voice was getting louder and more aggressive. "You think you deserve to be celebrated? Look around you. This is what success looks like. This is what achievement looks like. Your sister worked hard to get here, to earn this day, to become someone worthy of celebration. What have you done except whine and complain about how unfair life is? I built a company from nothing." I screamed, past caring who heard me. "I put myself through college. I've worked 16-hour days for the past 5 years to create something meaningful. But none of that matters to you because it wasn't handed to me on a silver platter the way everything was handed to Emma." "Don't you dare," he started, but I cut him off. "Don't I dare what? Tell the truth? Point out that Emma has had every advantage, every opportunity, every door open for her while I've had to fight for every single thing I've ever achieved. Don't I dare mention that you paid for her college while I took out loans? That you helped her buy her first house while I lived in a studio apartment for 6 years? That you introduced her to your business contacts while you've never even asked what my business does?" The room had gone almost completely silent now. Even the band had stopped playing, sensing the tension that was crackling through the air like electricity. 200 pairs of eyes were watching us, and I could feel their judgment, their disapproval, their discomfort at witnessing this family implosion. Dad was shaking with rage now, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You ungrateful little..." "I'm ungrateful?" I laughed hysterically. "What exactly should I be grateful for? For being ignored? For being dismissed? For being treated like a stranger at family gatherings? For watching you beam with pride over Emma while looking at me like I'm something unpleasant you stepped in? That's enough," he roared, and I saw his hand move before I could process what was happening. The slap echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. The force of it spun me around and sent me stumbling backward, my cheek erupting in fire and my ears ringing from the impact. The silence that followed was deafening, not just quiet, but absolutely, completely, devastatingly silent. I stood there, my hand pressed to my burning cheek, and looked around at 200 faces frozen in shock and horror. The photographer's camera was still raised, though I doubted he had captured this particular family moment. Emma had both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mom looked like she was about to faint. And Dad stood there breathing heavily, his hand still raised slightly from the follow-through of the slap, looking around at the crowd of witnesses with something that might have been panic flickering in his eyes. But you know what the worst part was? The thing that hurt more than the physical sting across my face, more than the public humiliation, more than the gasps and whispers of the crowd? It was the look in his eyes right after he hit me. Not remorse, not shock at his own actions, not horror at what he'd done to his own daughter in front of all these people. It was satisfaction. Like he'd been waiting years for an excuse to do exactly that. I looked around the room one more time, taking in all those faces staring at me with a mixture of pity and judgment. Some looked horrified at what they'd witnessed. Others looked uncomfortable, like they wished they were anywhere else. A few looked almost entertained, like they were watching a particularly dramatic reality show. And that's when I realized something that would change everything. I wasn't just the victim in this story anymore. I was tired of being the victim, tired of absorbing everyone else's cruelty and dysfunction and pretending it was normal. I was done being the family scapegoat, the emotional punching bag, the daughter who was supposed to smile and take whatever scraps of affection were thrown her way. I wasn't just slapped by a hand. I was slapped by years of rejection, decades of dismissal, a lifetime of being treated like I didn't matter. And as I stood there with my cheek burning and my dignity scattered across the marble floor, I made a decision that would echo through our family for years to come. I was done being invisible. I was done being the quiet one who suffered in silence. I was done protecting people who had never once protected me. Without saying a word, I turned and walked toward the exit. My heels clicked against the marble floor with a steady rhythm that seemed to echo through the silent ballroom. I didn't run, I didn't sob, I didn't collapse in a dramatic heap. I walked with my head high and my shoulders straight, even though every step felt like walking through broken glass. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, guests stepping aside to create a clear path to the door. Nobody tried to stop me, nobody reached out to comfort me, nobody said a word. They just watched as I made my walk of shame through the elegant ballroom, past the crystal chandeliers and silk drapes and beautiful flower arrangements, past all the trappings of my sister's perfect day that had just been destroyed by our family's ugly truth. I could feel their eyes on me, could hear the whispers starting to bubble up behind me as I reached the door. I could imagine what they were saying. How awful for Emma. What a terrible thing to happen at a wedding. That poor girl, making such a scene. How embarrassing for the family. But as I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't care what they thought anymore. For the first time in my life, I genuinely didn't care about their judgment or their disapproval or their discomfort. They had all sat there and watched my father humiliate and assault me, and not one of them had stood up for me. Not one of them had said, "That's enough," or "You can't treat your daughter that way," or even, "Maybe we should call security." They were all complicit in their silence, and their opinions meant nothing to me now. I found myself in the garden behind the mansion, surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges and blooming roses that looked almost artificial in their perfection. There was a bench tucked away in a corner, partially hidden by flowering vines, and I sank down onto it with my legs shaking and my adrenaline finally starting to crash. This was supposed to be the part where I broke down completely, where I sobbed until I couldn't breathe and called my best friend to come rescue me from the wreckage of my family relationships. This was supposed to be the part where I felt sorry for myself and wondered what I had done wrong and how I could fix this terrible situation. But as I sat there in the moonlight with my cheek still throbbing from my father's hand, a different emotion was taking hold. Not sadness, not self-pity, not even anger anymore. It was clarity. Cold, sharp, crystalline clarity that cut through all the confusion and pain and showed me exactly what I needed to do. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen for a long moment, my finger hovering over the contact list. 28 years of trying to be the good daughter, the understanding daughter, the daughter who absorbed everyone else's dysfunction and kept the family secrets and protected people who had never once protected me. 28 years of being told I was ordinary, unremarkable, not worth celebrating or acknowledging or even basic human decency. 28 years was long enough. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. My hand was surprisingly steady as I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a familiar voice answered. "Sarah? Is that you? I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight." "Hello, Detective Morrison," I said, my voice calm and professional despite everything that had just happened. "I'm sorry to call you so late, but I need to talk to you about my father. About Thomas Richardson. I think it's time I told you what I know." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear him sitting up straighter in his chair. "Are you sure about this, Sarah? Once we start down this road, there's no going back." I looked back toward the mansion, where warm light spilled from the ballroom windows, and I could hear the faint sound of music starting up again. The party was continuing, Emma's perfect day was being salvaged, and my father was probably already spinning the story to make me look like the unstable daughter who couldn't handle her sister's success. "I'm sure," I said. "I have documents, photographs, recorded conversations. Everything you need to prove what he's been doing. Everything I should have given you 3 months ago when you first contacted me." "Sarah." His voice was gentle but serious. "You understand what this means? The charges we'll be able to bring? The impact on your family." I almost laughed at that. My family? The people who had just watched my father slap me in front of 200 guests and done nothing. The people who had spent my entire life treating me like an inconvenience, a disappointment, a shameful secret to be hidden away. "My family," I said, and there was steel in my voice now. "My family stopped caring about me a long time ago. It's time I stopped caring about them." 20 minutes. That's all it took to change everything. 20 minutes of quiet conversation with Detective Morrison, 20 minutes of finally telling the truth about what I had discovered in my father's business dealings 6 months ago. 20 minutes of providing the evidence that would bring down the man who had just humiliated me in front of everyone who mattered to him. You see, my father's business empire wasn't built on the legitimate success he liked to brag about. It was built on fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and a dozen other financial crimes that he'd been covering up for years. I had discovered it by accident when I was helping my mother with some paperwork, and I had spent months agonizing over what to do with the information. Family loyalty had kept me silent, even when Detective Morrison first approached me as part of their investigation. I had deflected, denied, protected the man who had never once protected me. I had chosen to be the good daughter even when it meant being complicit in criminal behavior. But sitting in that garden with my cheek still burning from his hand, I realized that my loyalty had been a one-way street. I had been protecting someone who viewed me as expendable, who would throw me under the bus without a second thought if it served his purposes. As I finished my conversation with Detective Morrison and hung up the phone, I felt something I had never experienced before: true power. Not the petty satisfaction of getting revenge, but the deep, quiet power of someone who had finally chosen to stand up for themselves and for what was right. I sat there for a few more minutes, listening to the sounds of the party continuing inside. The band was playing again, people were laughing and talking, and life was going on as if nothing had happened. As if I had never existed at all. But in a few hours, everything would change. The investigation that had been stalled for months would suddenly have all the evidence it needed. Warrants would be issued, accounts would be frozen, and my father's carefully constructed empire would come crashing down around him. And the most beautiful part? It would all happen at the perfect moment, when he was surrounded by everyone whose opinion mattered to him, everyone he wanted to impress, everyone who made up his precious social and professional network. The same people who had just watched him assault his own daughter would get to watch him be destroyed by the consequences of his own actions. I stood up from the bench and smoothed down my dress, checking my appearance in my phone's camera. My cheek was still red from the slap, but my eyes were clear and determined. I looked like someone who had just made the most important decision of their life. It was time to go back inside. The ballroom was buzzing with activity when I returned, though I noticed the conversation seemed more subdued than before. Groups of guests huddled together, speaking in low voices that stopped when they noticed me walking by. I could feel their eyes following me, could sense the mixture of curiosity and discomfort that my presence created. Emma was on the dance floor with Richard, trying to recapture the joy of her wedding day, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the forced brightness of her smile. This wasn't how she had imagined her perfect day unfolding, and I felt a pang of genuine regret for that. She didn't deserve to have her wedding overshadowed by our family's dysfunction. But then I caught sight of my father holding court at the bar, already deep into damage control mode. He was surrounded by his business associates and longtime friends, no doubt spinning the story to paint me as the unstable daughter who couldn't handle her own irrelevance. His cheek was flushed from alcohol and adrenaline, his gestures animated as he painted his version of events. "She's always been jealous of Emma," I heard him saying as I approached close enough to eavesdrop. Ever since they were children, she couldn't stand that her sister was more successful, more accomplished. Tonight she just finally snapped and made a scene. Honestly, I'm worried about her mental state. The men around him nodded sympathetically, making appropriately concerned noises about the burden of having a troubled child. They were eating up his performance, buying into his narrative that I was the problem, the broken one, the daughter who needed to be managed and contained. I almost felt sorry for them. They had no idea what was coming. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced down to see a text from Detective Morrison. "Everything is in motion. Thank you for finally trusting us with the truth. Justice is coming." I looked back up at my father, still holding court, still playing the role of the long-suffering parent dealing with a difficult child. In a few hours, he would understand exactly what it felt like to be powerless, to be humiliated, to have your entire world turned upside down by forces beyond your control. The difference was, I had never deserved what he had done to me. He absolutely deserved what was about to happen to him. I made my way to the bar and ordered a glass of wine, positioning myself close enough to my father's group to hear their conversation, but far enough away to avoid direct confrontation. I wanted to be here for what was about to happen. I wanted to witness the moment when his carefully constructed facade began to crumble. "The girl has always been unstable," he was saying, his voice louder now, emboldened by the alcohol and the sympathetic audience. "We've tried everything: therapy, medication, family counseling. Nothing seems to help." Tonight was just the latest example of her inability to cope with reality. Uncle Joe nodded gravely. "It must be so difficult for you, Tom. Having one daughter who's such a success and another who's..." He trailed off diplomatically. "A disappointment," Dad finished for him. "It breaks my heart, but sometimes you have to accept that some children just don't turn out the way you hope. Emma has always been everything we dreamed of in a daughter. As for the other one..." He shrugged as if I were a failed business venture rather than his own flesh and blood. I sipped my wine and checked the time on my phone. Any minute now. That's when I saw the first police car pull up outside the window. Then another. Then a third. The red and blue lights were flashing, painting the elegant ballroom in alternating colors that seemed almost festive until you realized what they meant. I watched as Detective Morrison stepped out of an unmarked sedan, followed by 2 FBI agents in dark suits. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who had been planning this moment for months. My father was still talking, still performing for his audience, completely oblivious to the fact that his world was about to end. Just have to accept that not every child can live up to your expectations. Some people are meant for greatness and others. His phone buzzed on the bar beside him. He glanced at it absently, probably expecting a text about golf or business or some other mundane aspect of his privileged life. Instead, he saw a notification that made his face go white as paper. Federal arrest warrant issued for Thomas Richardson. Surrender immediately or face additional charges. I watched as his hands began to shake, as the phone slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the bar. The men around him were still talking, still offering their sympathetic platitudes about difficult daughters and family burdens, but he couldn't hear them anymore. He was staring at that phone screen like it contained his own death sentence. Which, in a way, it did. Tom, are you all right? Uncle Joe was saying, following my father's horrified gaze to the phone. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Dad tried to speak, but only a strangled sound came out. He grabbed the phone with trembling hands, reading the notification over and over as if the words might change if he stared at them long enough. That's when Detective Morrison walked into the ballroom. The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as guests noticed the law enforcement officers making their way through the elegant crowd. The music faltered and died as the band members realized something serious was happening. Even Emma stopped dancing, staring with confusion and growing alarm at the uniformed figures moving through her wedding reception. Detective Morrison spotted my father immediately and began walking in his direction with calm, professional determination. Behind him, the FBI agents flanked out to cover the exits, their presence sending a wave of nervous energy through the room. I moved closer, wanting to see every detail of what was about to unfold. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small and worthless would finally understand what real powerlessness felt like. Thomas Richardson? Detective Morrison's voice cut through the sudden quiet of the ballroom. Dad looked up from his phone, his face a mask of confusion and terror. Yes, that's me. But I don't understand. There must be some mistake. No mistake, sir, Morrison replied, pulling out his badge and holding it up for everyone to see. I'm Detective Morrison with the Financial Crimes Division, and these are Special Agents Chin and Rodriguez with the FBI. You're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit embezzlement. The words echoed through the silent ballroom like bombs exploding. Guests gasped and whispered, craning their necks to get a better view of the scene unfolding. Emma let out a strangled cry from the dance floor, and I saw Mom sink into a chair, her face pale with shock. This is ridiculous. Dad sputtered, his voice high and panicked. I haven't done anything wrong. This is a mistake, a misunderstanding. Sir, you have the right to remain silent, Agent Chin continued, stepping forward with handcuffs. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Wait. Dad's voice cracked with desperation. You can't do this here. This is my daughter's wedding. These are my friends, my colleagues. You're destroying my reputation. I almost laughed at that. He was worried about his reputation? After what he had done to me in front of these same people just an hour ago. You have the right to an attorney. Agent Rodriguez continued the Miranda rights as if Dad hadn't spoken. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. Thomas Richardson, pillar of the community, successful businessman, proud father of the bride, stood there in his expensive tuxedo with his hands cuffed behind his back, looking smaller and more helpless than I had ever seen him. This can't be happening, he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. This can't be happening. But it was happening. 6 months of investigation, 3 months of gathering evidence, and 20 minutes of my finally telling the truth had led to this moment. Justice, served cold and precise in front of everyone who mattered to him. The guests were in chaos now. Some were whispering frantically among themselves, others were pulling out their phones to record the scene, and a few were quietly making their way toward the exits. Emma was sobbing in Richard's arms, her perfect wedding dress wrinkled and her makeup running down her cheeks. How do you know about? Dad started to ask Detective Morrison, then stopped himself, probably remembering the advice about remaining silent. But I could see the wheels turning in his head, the desperate attempt to figure out how his carefully hidden crimes had been exposed. His eyes swept the crowd, looking for answers, looking for someone to blame. When his gaze landed on me, standing calmly by the bar with my wine glass in hand, something shifted in his expression. Understanding. Recognition. Realization. He knew. Somehow, he knew that I was the one who had brought his world crashing down. You, he breathed, staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and rage. You did this. I met his gaze steadily, feeling no shame, no regret, no fear. I told the truth, I said simply. Something you taught me never to do, but I learned anyway. Do you know what this means? He hissed, struggling against the handcuffs. Do you know what you've done to this family? To your sister's day? To everything we've built. I know exactly what this means, I replied, my voice calm and clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. It means that actions have consequences. It means that you can't treat people like they don't matter and expect them to protect you forever. It means that sometimes the quiet one in the room has more power than you think. Detective Morrison was starting to lead him toward the exit, but Dad twisted around to keep staring at me. You vindictive little. Sir, I strongly advise you to stop talking, Agent Chin interrupted firmly. But Dad was beyond listening to advice. 20 years of viewing me as weak and controllable had made him forget that even the most patient person has a breaking point. This is what I get for having you as a daughter, he shouted as they escorted him through the crowd. I should have disowned you years ago. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. And now you've destroyed everything out of spite. The words that might have devastated me an hour ago bounced off me like raindrops. I had heard worse from him, and more importantly, I no longer cared what he thought of me. His opinion had no power over me anymore. The only thing I destroyed, I called after him, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, was the lie you've been living. The truth was always going to come out eventually. I just decided it was time. As they led him away, I could hear him ranting about ungrateful children and family loyalty and how I had betrayed everything he had given me. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. He was accusing me of betrayal while being arrested for betraying the trust of dozens of clients and investors. The ballroom erupted in chaos as soon as he was gone. Guests clustered together in excited groups, gossiping about what they had just witnessed. Phones were buzzing with text messages and social media posts. The wedding reception had become the scandal of the year, and everyone wanted to be the first to share the news. Emma collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed by the destruction of her perfect day. Richard was trying to comfort her while simultaneously dealing with the logistics of what this meant for their honeymoon, their future, their association with our family name. Mom was surrounded by relatives and friends, all offering sympathy and support for the terrible shock she had just endured. And me? I stood there in the middle of it all, feeling strangely peaceful for the first time in years. The same people who had watched my father slap me and done nothing were now falling over themselves to express their outrage at his crimes. The same relatives who had spent the evening talking about what a wonderful man he was were now whispering about red flags they claimed to have noticed years ago. The same business associates who had been laughing at his jokes an hour earlier were now distancing themselves as quickly as possible. It was fascinating to watch how quickly loyalty evaporated when reputation was on the line. These people who had enabled his behavior, who had looked the other way when he treated me like garbage, who had reinforced his sense of superiority and entitlement. Now they were all eager to condemn him and pretend they had never supported him in the first place. But I wasn't interested in their sudden change of heart. I wasn't looking for their sympathy or their validation or their belated recognition of what kind of man my father really was. I had learned something important tonight. I didn't need their approval to have value, and I didn't need their support to have power. As I set down my wine glass and prepared to leave, Emma appeared at my side. Her face was streaked with tears and mascara, her perfect hair was disheveled, and her dream wedding dress was wrinkled from her collapse. "How could you do this?" she whispered, her voice broken with grief and rage. "How could you destroy my wedding? How could you destroy our family?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw her clearly. Not as the golden child who had everything handed to her, not as the favorite daughter who could do no wrong, but as someone who had been just as damaged by our father's behavior as I was, just in a different way. She had never learned to question his authority because she had never needed to. She had never developed strength or independence because she had never been forced to. She had never understood that love shouldn't be conditional because hers never had been. In some ways, she was just as much a victim of his dysfunction as I was. But that didn't change what needed to happen. "I didn't destroy our family, Emma," I said gently. "Our family was already destroyed. I just stopped pretending it wasn't." "But why tonight?" she sobbed. "Why did it have to be tonight?" I considered lying to spare her feelings, making up some story about coincidental timing or forces beyond my control. But I was done lying to protect people who had never protected me. "Because tonight he slapped me in front of 200 people," I said simply. "Because tonight he made it clear that I will never matter to him, no matter what I do or how hard I try. Because tonight I finally realized that I was protecting someone who would never protect me." She stared at me with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "So you decided to ruin my wedding as revenge?" "No," I said firmly. "I decided to stop covering up his crimes. The timing wasn't revenge, it was justice. He chose to assault me at your wedding. I chose to finally tell the truth about who he really is." Emma opened her mouth to argue, but I held up my hand to stop her. "For 28 years, I've been the family scapegoat," I continued. "Every time Dad did something cruel or unfair, everyone expected me to just take it and keep quiet to preserve family harmony. Every time he humiliated me or dismissed me or treated me like I didn't exist, I was supposed to smile and pretend it was normal. Well, I'm done pretending." "But the wedding. The wedding would have been ruined anyway," I interrupted. "Do you really think a man who commits federal crimes for years can keep that secret forever? Do you think the FBI investigation was just going to disappear? This was always going to come out, Emma. The only choice was whether I was going to keep protecting him or start protecting myself." She looked around the chaotic ballroom, taking in the clusters of gossiping guests, the abandoned dance floor, the shattered remains of her perfect day. "Everyone will remember this. Every time someone talks about my wedding, this is what they'll remember." I felt a pang of genuine sympathy for her. She was right, this would overshadow her wedding for the rest of her life. But that wasn't my fault, and it wasn't my responsibility to fix. "Then maybe," I said quietly, "you'll understand a little bit of what it felt like to be me for the past 28 years. To have every important moment in my life overshadowed by his cruelty or his indifference. To have every achievement dismissed and every failure magnified. To be constantly reminded that I would never be good enough, never be worthy of his love or respect." Emma's tears were flowing freely now, but I could see something shifting in her expression. For the first time in our lives, she was really seeing me, not as the jealous sister or the family disappointment, but as someone who had been suffering in silence while she basked in unconditional love. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't realize how bad it was." "Because it was easier not to know," I replied, not unkindly. "Because acknowledging it would have meant challenging him, and you never had to do that. But I'm done being the sacrifice that keeps this family functioning. I'm done absorbing everyone else's dysfunction so the rest of you can pretend we're normal." I reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "I'm sorry your wedding was ruined, Emma. I genuinely am. You deserved better than this. But so did I, and nobody seemed to care about that until tonight." Before she could respond, I turned and walked away. I had said everything I needed to say, and I had nothing left to give to this family that had taken so much from me for so long. As I made my way through the crowd toward the exit, I felt eyes following me everywhere I went. Some looks were sympathetic, others were judgmental, and a few were simply curious. But for the first time in my life, I truly didn't care what any of these people thought about me. I had spent decades trying to earn their approval, their acceptance, their basic human decency. I had twisted myself into knots trying to be worthy of love that was never going to come. I had sacrificed my own well-being, my own truth, my own sense of justice to maintain a peace that only existed because I was willing to suffer in silence. No more. As I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the cool night air, I felt something I had never experienced before, complete and total freedom. Not just from my father's cruelty, but from the entire toxic system that had enabled and encouraged it for so long. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morrison. "Richardson is being processed now. Thank you again for your courage in coming forward. Your testimony will help us put him away for a very long time." I smiled as I typed back, "Thank you for believing me and for giving me the chance to finally do the right thing." As I walked to my car, I could hear the sounds of the reception slowly resuming behind me. The band was playing again, though more quietly than before. Voices were rising and falling in animated conversation. Life was moving on, as it always does, even after the most dramatic upheavals. But my life would never be the same. I had burned the bridges that connected me to a family that had never really wanted me anyway, and I had chosen justice over the comfortable lie that had protected my father for so long. For the first time in 28 years, I was truly free to be myself, to build my own life, to surround myself with people who valued me for who I was rather than tolerating me out of obligation. As I drove away from the mansion, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. My cheek was still red from my father's slap, but my eyes were clear and bright with something I had never seen there before: genuine peace. I had spent my entire life believing that I was the problem, that I was somehow defective or unworthy of love. Tonight, I had learned that the problem was never me. It was a system that demanded I sacrifice my dignity, my truth, and my well-being to protect people who would never do the same for me. Never underestimate the quiet one in the room. We're not weak, we're gathering strength. We're not passive, we're choosing our moment. And when we finally decide we've had enough, when we finally choose ourselves over the people who have never chosen us, we can change everything with a single phone call. Before you scroll past this story, I want you to think about something. How many of us suffer in silence, accepting treatment we would never tolerate from strangers, all because we're told that family loyalty requires us to absorb dysfunction and call it love? How many of us have been convinced that setting boundaries is selfish, that standing up for ourselves is cruel, that protecting our own well-being is somehow a betrayal of the people who have spent years betraying us? The truth is, you don't owe anyone your silence in the face of abuse. You don't owe anyone your complicity in covering up their crimes. You don't owe anyone your dignity as payment for their approval. What happened to me that night wasn't just about one man's arrest or one family's dysfunction. It was about the moment when someone who had been powerless for her entire life finally realized that she had more strength than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. It was about choosing truth over comfort, justice over peace, and self-respect over the false harmony that comes from pretending everything is fine when it absolutely isn't. My father is serving a 15-year sentence in federal prison now. The investigation revealed millions of dollars in fraud and dozens of victims whose lives were destroyed by his greed. Emma's marriage survived the scandal, though it took months of therapy and a complete restructuring of her relationship with money and family loyalty. Mom eventually found the strength to divorce him and rebuild her life on her own terms. And me? I'm finally living the life I was always meant to live, surrounded by people who see my worth and appreciate my strength. I've learned that being the quiet one doesn't make you weak, it makes you powerful in ways that loud, aggressive people can never understand. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't screaming or fighting back or making a scene. Sometimes it's simply refusing to protect someone who has never protected you. Sometimes it's choosing to tell the truth after years of covering up lies. Sometimes it's walking away with your dignity intact while their world crumbles under the weight of their own actions. Comment below with your country and the time you're watching this, and remember, no matter who tries to make you feel small, no matter who tries to convince you that you don't matter, you always have the power to rewrite your own story. You always have the power to choose dignity over dysfunction, truth over lies, and yourself over people who have never chosen you. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places, and remember, the quiet ones are often the most dangerous, because we're the ones who notice everything, remember everything, and choose our moments carefully. Your story doesn't end with someone else's cruelty. It begins the moment you decide you deserve better.